Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Hello, everyone. My name is Hayin Estes, and I'm a research fellow at Chris. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar where we're going to have a discussion with author Dr. Nadav Samin about his book of Sand or Soil, Genealogy and Tribal Belonging in Saudi Arabia. Before we get to the book, please allow me to give a short introduction about the author. Dr. Nadav Samin, he is a historian of the modern Middle East who has conducted extensive research and interviews about Saudi Arabia. His first book of Sand or Soil won the runner-up prize for 2016 British Kuwaiti Friendship Society Award. His book also published in Arabic by Jadawul. Dr. Samin writes articles about culture, politics, society of Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, which has appeared in different journals such as Wall Street Journal. He also taught in different universities such as Hunter University and Dartmouth University as well. So I'm so happy and honored to welcome you, Dr. Nadav. Thank you so much for joining us. So to start our discussion, I want to start it with the title of your book. It's very obvious. It's about the tribes, and this topic is it's very unique, rare topic to be covered both in English and Arabic literature. So I'm very interested and curious to know, why did you choose to write in a book about the tribal belonging in Saudi Arabia? And also if you can tell us about the context and the framework of your work.
Absolutely, Haneen. Thank you very much for the invitation and the invitation of the King Faisal Center. I'm pleased to be able to share some of the fruits of my research over a number of years in the kingdom with your distinguished audience. So to give you the broader backdrop on why I chose the topic of this book, I had spent time a few decades ago now almost in Morocco and Egypt, almost a year and a half living mostly in Egypt, but and also in Morocco. But these two very rich Arab countries with rich histories were my introductions to Arab societies, Arabic language, culture, poetry, all these features that are common throughout the region. Both countries had been studied, and these frameworks, culture, politics, history, had been explored in the Western scholarly literature by different scholars. And it occurred to me as I was trying to develop my expertise, my interests, my thought of what I might contribute, Saudi Arabia was a place that seemed to me relatively underexplored when it came to the history of the society of the peoples of Saudi Arabia, or the societies, if we are breaking it down into the different sociological categories of al-Badu, al-Hadar. I knew setting out in my dissertation work at Princeton that I wanted to do a few things. One, I wanted to make a contribution in the study of modern Saudi history. Two, I wanted it to be an archivally grounded study. There are a number of good studies on the kingdom, mostly by political scientists, sociologists, a few anthropologists who had done some localized studies regionally, but an archivally grounded study of the kingdom's history, one rooted in documents. I did not have a reference point for that. And I thought that would be a great contribution. And so, with the exception, I suppose, of David Cummins' book on the Wahhabi mission, which is a very good book, and looks at al-Khitab ad-Dini, the religious discourse of Wahhabiyya and Salafiyya and so forth. So I wanted to find other troves of documents and try to make sense of them for what they tell us about Saudi society. The other thing I wanted to do, and this was in keeping with my methodological training at Princeton and my own inclinations, having read in the political science literature, in the sociology and anthropology of Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, I wanted to privilege local narratives and voices. If it wasn't in Arabic, it was less interesting to me. it was less relevant to my interests. And with the great assistance of my advisor at Princeton, Dr. Bernard Haeckel, and Dr. Michael Cook, another teacher of mine at Princeton, who honed my abilities, and Bernard in particular got my access to Saudi Arabia through the auspices of the King Faisal Center, and then through the assistance of a number of Saudi scholars and officials, and in fact, even the family of Khaled Jasser himself, I was able to identify a document set, a collection of documents that would prove to me to be a real, I would just say, astounding adventure through the social life, the complications and contradictions of what it means to be, what it meant to be a Saudi citizen in the 20th century. And as I was rummaging through Khaled Jasser's library, looking at some of the drafts of monographs that he had written, looking at books he had collected and manuscripts he had collected, I saw on the top shelf murasalat. I saw the correspondence, the letters that had been expertly compiled and organized by the librarian who had been hired by the family to keep track of the late scholar Alamat al-Jazira's papers. And I pulled them down, I started looking through them. And these were the Kanz al-Ansab, the real Kanz al-Ansab, as far as I'm concerned. Here we had communications from Saudis all around the kingdom with the late scholar concerning their deepest worries, their most pressing needs. That is to say, who am I nasabiyan? Who am I genealogically? Because I need to get married. My family needs to marry another family because I lost my history. I don't know where we come from. I'm not sure if we were Badu. I'm not sure if we were Hadar. I'm not sure of anything. Please help me. Ya Sheikh. And when I saw this, I realized that I had found a treasure in terms of a scholarly treasure, a set of data points that if they were pulled together with the right context and the right assistance, that is to say, the right expert aid by the countless Saudis who helped me understand the subtext of what I was reading. If that was pulled together, then it would make for a significant contribution to scholarship. And so that is, in a nutshell, why I wanted to write this book, because the topic had not been really addressed. It had not been addressed in an archivally grounded way. And it just seemed too compelling to consider any other alternative after I had encountered the correspondence in Maktabat al-Arab.
So, yeah, the focus of Khaled Jasser, Sheikh Khaled Jasser in your book was very obvious. Actually, you devoted the whole first chapter of your book about the context of his life. But I want to know how someone such very prominent historian like Sheikh Khaled Jasser, who came from very humble beginnings and environment at that time, was able to raise and be such a historian. I don't know, like if you can tell us what is the features or the special events that's brought him to this level, because when I was reading your book, I know of the work of Khaled Jasser before, but the book, you revealed a texture of his life that I did not see before. So I don't know if you can share this with us.
Well, thanks. As best as I can reconstruct it, a person's life is one of the most complex phenomena we could face. And I realize upon preparing for this kind invitation that there are aspects of Al-Alama's life that I barely touched upon in the book. For example, his travels throughout Europe, his travels to the United States, where he worked to seek out manuscripts. You know, this lends a different texture to the person. I'm focused on an Arab Saudi historical heritage story. So I wanted to caveat, but from what I understand, often when we talk about the history of Saudi Arabia or the scholarship on Saudi Arabia, there's a lot of emphasis on structural features. So the rentier system, the rentier state, which is an idea of that explains how oil states work and their effects on citizens. This is sort of a structuring mechanism that seems to determine a lot of life in the kingdom by the measure of many scholars. We could talk about religion and religious orthodoxy as being a structuring mechanism that determines how people act, what they think. Missing from those analytical frameworks is a key consideration: individual will, the will of an individual to make choices about their life. I believe that Khaled Jasser's signature quality was his willpower to forge his own path, to become the person that he wanted to be within the constraints that his society imposed on him. So that's my preface, and I'll step back and give you a little bit of more context before I describe some of the features I think that characterize him. Practically speaking, Khaled Jasser, born 1909 to the year 2000, died in 2000. He lived throughout the 20th century. And what is amazing about this man is that he documented most of his life. You cannot say that about too many other people in 20th century Saudi Arabia. He was a witness to the entirety of the founding history of the kingdom. And paying attention to what he said over those decades unto itself is a useful project, right? It happened as well that he had this will, this desire to forge his own vision of his vocation, that is his profession, his professional life, his own vision of what might be an aesthetic for Saudis, what might be a way of articulating a new form of cultural refinement. And he found that in Nasab in some ways. I think an aspect of that is artistic. But let's start at the beginning. He was educated by the ulama ad-din. First, his grandfather in Al-Burud, and then by the Al-Sheikh at the Beit al-Ikhwan, where he moved in Riyadh, where he moved to in Riyadh in 1926. So if we talk about his worldview, it is grounded first in a very traditional, millennium-old way of understanding the world, understanding what constitutes important knowledge, what constitutes justice, morality, and all these things, and history, and poetry, and so forth. He's rooted primarily in this framework, this distinctive framework of thought. Where does he first encounter alternate systems of thought? In Mecca, in 1930, he enrolls in the Ma'had al-Ilmi, where he meets teachers who originate in other parts of the Arab world and have themselves come into contact, maybe been educated in hybrid traditions of thought, traditions that mingle that traditional Islamic worldview with Western influenced educational practices and ideas. And he is intrigued by this, so much so that he gets himself a position on the Ba'atha to Cairo in 1939, the student delegation, where he gets to study at Cairo University. He's the first he's the first Saudi student to enroll in the Kulliyat al-Adab Hinak. And unfortunately, World War II cuts short his stay in Cairo. But there is a furtherance of his sort of the synthesizing of his traditionally rooted worldview and education with a flavor of Western training, Western influence training. If he had gone on to a PhD in Europe or the United States or Egypt, would he have become Alamat al-Jazira في الأنساب والمواضع ومواقع والتاريخ? I'm not sure. It was, I think, his primary grounding in the tradition that makes him what I describe as one of the last of the traditional Islamic scholars, where he created a modern literary journal that concerned the disciplines of the Islamic scholarly tradition, and Ansab and history, some of the disciplines. And he did it in a way that was as much traditional as it was modern. So other qualities that I think describe him were the fact that he was precocious as a youth and very tenacious as an adult. He wasn't satisfied with the status quo or received wisdom. And one of the things that strikes me about his writings when you review them is his gift for rhetoric, his ability to capture subtle emotions in his writing, in his letters in particular, but also some of his books. Of course, he was nominated to the Majma' al-Lugha al-Arabi, and he took the place there with other distinguished Arab linguists and grammarians of the 20th century. So his mastery was known quite well. But I think we should also underscore that he was an important thinker, an important intellectual. I believe that one that might not have had opportunity to fully express himself in every instance, in every way that he wished to at his time, which makes him all the more remarkable. If you read his critiques of some of the hegemonic religious discourse and the religious establishment in the 50s, they are quite clever and quite subtle, not subtle enough to avoid trouble for him, but they show a restless mind that wants to push the envelope, push the boundaries of discourse in his society without any radical breakage. That's the thing. He wanted to enlighten from within. And I think if we look at his sort of most sustained and interesting intellectual contribution, we find it in the arguments that he makes in the book Bahila, Al-Qabila al-Muftara alayha, where there he displays his mastery of the discourses of his society, tribal, religious, and nationalist, all synthesized into a potent argument against a scholarly foe. I'll elaborate maybe a little bit on that as we move forward. But lastly, I'll say that what distinguishes him for me is I have a little bit of a personal habit and tick that recalls my time in his library, where I noted that every scrap of paper in the library was put to use. There was no waste. He didn't throw out paper. He remembered where he came from, a mud brick village in the middle of a very arid part of a very arid country and part of the world. And as I sort through my children's scribbles and drawings, deciding whether to keep or recycle them, every time I make that decision, I think about Khaled Jasser and the scraps of paper in his library that he never threw out because he knew he might need them. You're muted, Haneen. You're still muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So just following the topic of Sheikh Khaled Jasser and his work, you also cover his work, which is his book Jamhara, which is served as an index of the well-known families. And you mentioned this book and you describe it as this book played a substantial social role. So I would be interested to know your perspective, how availability of this book impact socially on the identity and the consciousness of the tribal lineages.
The Jamhara is an important book at multiple levels. I don't think we should overstate its ubiquity. That is, it isn't the case that every family had a copy on their shelf. Khaled Jasser himself described how many copies were piled up in the warehouse collecting dust. And yet, in a society that is valuing of social authority around sort of small networks where smaller Hamad Jassers or other family patriarchs or family historians, keepers of lore, keepers of knowledge about family relationships are leaned on and depended on for making social decisions, the Jamhara becomes quite a significant reference point, especially when it comes to marital questions. The Jamhara, of course, encompasses, it's an index. It's an index of names of families and attributions of those families to different tribes. So if a family is looking to marry into another family, it might have sought out a person who had the book or knowledge of the contents of the book and asked them, what is this last name? Can you look it up for me? You know, I was told that this is a kind of practice that happened. And I also heard firsthand that in other books subsequent to the Jamhara that were maybe specific to a tribe in particular, they were used as well for such marital negotiations, sometimes in loose ways to be able to seal the deal, so to speak. But the Jamhara itself should be looked at on a range of levels. I think, firstly, it is a practical guide, a reference document that was used among Nejdi families in particular. But it's also a window into a society, a marker of its time. I argue in my book that through the Jamhara and through the letters that concern it, sent to Al-Hamat al-Jazeera by Saudis all around the kingdom, we have a window into a society in formation. Whereas before, the concerns, the interests, the relationships between members of the society were not textualized, were not documented, fixed in stone or fixed in print for anyone to evaluate. Hamad Jasser, through his efforts to establish a newspaper, and later through his efforts to establish a publishing house, a magazine where he would field readers' letters, creates almost an exchange, a social exchange that is solidifying a society in the process, or an aspect, one important aspect of a newly emergent, if you will, national community. So the Jamhara is like a telephone, and the letters, which we look at in conjunction with the Jamhara, are like a telephone exchange, like one of those old switchboards. Hamad Jasser is the operator. People are calling, and he's plugging the switchboard in, connecting different concepts and notions. The Jamhara could not have been written today. Certainly not. Even 15 years ago, 20 years ago, probably. It was too expansive in its claims, as the scholar himself learned with the sometimes heavy resistance to his attributions, to the ascriptions of certain individuals to certain tribal communities and groups. It is sort of an artifact of its era, of that time when the documenting of lineages at this sort of almost national, at least regional scale, could be seen as a relatively innocent project, not one that had the controversy that Nasab has today. Everywhere I went in the kingdom, I was told, Al-Ansab mawdu'a shaykh, mawdu'a hassasi, But then the person would probably want to talk to me for about an hour about the subject. So it's yet another of the interesting complexities and / contradictions about this concern of Nasab, this interest in Nasab, and also a desire to, as a scholar, did his best to treat the topic gently, did his best to do that. But he was not prepared, as I write, for the onrush of popular sentiments that met his project. You remember, this is the scholar of high culture. He is the lover of al-Asma'i and of Hamdani, the great philologists and geographers of the classical tradition. This is the world he's inhabiting. And yet ansab is not Sam'ani's ansab. It's not, it's not, if he had a pretense to reproduce the tradition in his own society, he was, I think, shocked or surprised by the reaction of people from all walks of life to that effort to establish sort of ansab as a high cultural practice within his society.
So moving from the tribe of belonging a little bit, as Saudi Arabia, an Islamic country, the religious side is very important. And it seems like that tribal identity and the religious identity all competed within the Saudi individual. So I want to know if you, from your studies, how do you see this complex relation between religious and tribal identity throughout the history of Saudi Arabia has been evolved until today?
The question that you raise, Haneen, is an immensely complex one, given that the two discourses that you're invoking, the tribal discourse on the one hand and the religious discourse on the other, are both unto themselves highly complicated and variegated or diverse, even within their own frameworks. I believe that this is a frontier for future study and scholarship by historians and anthropologists and political scientists. But from my understanding, with a sort of historical anthropological bent, I will try to summarize my view on this challenging subject. From the earliest outset, from the early days of the Wahhabi Da'wah, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab himself expressed the common hadar, or sedentary oasis dwellers' view toward the Bedouin tribal communities. His view was characterized by skepticism, suspicion, concern that the Bedouin threatened sedentary life, and specifically in his case, his religious mission. The sentiments that he captures in his letters from the middle to the late 18th century, I think, carry over into the 19th and 20th century, and to a degree to the present, with some qualifications that maybe we can get to. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab described these Bedouin, the tribes, as al-Sawad al-A'zam, which philologically could take us to something akin to dark matter, to borrow a concept from physics, which I apply to chapter 2 of my book and used for the title of my dissertation. Dark matter. 90% of the universe, according to physicists, is matter that cannot be seen or even measured, but its gravitational pull shapes the other 10% in ways that are profound and determining, maybe. Now, stepping out of the realm of the hard sciences and using dark matter as a metaphor, which perhaps Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab was alluding to, perhaps not, the pull of tribal values, ideas, discourses persisted for a long time. And here I'm defining the tribe initially in its original state as a nomadic phenomenon. What happens in the 20th century is tahjir, the settling of the nomadic tribes in the towns and the villages, eventually in the cities, with Hazar, with traditionally sedentary folk, the intermingling of these populations into a national community where, through education and mass education and the press, there's a kind of effort to normalize, to render similar and same the attitudes and worldviews and outlooks of these populations. Certainly, religious discourse, religious ideology are the spearhead or the main instrument through which this normalizing is taking place. Is the state is leaning on its religious leaders and thinkers and scholars to bring these communities together into a common experience. But of course, in the way that religion cannot challenge, I think, the state's exercise of its prerogatives, the tribe, because it is essentially a political unit at its core, or I should say, in its origins, there's always the tendency to think of the tribal group as an autonomous collective. That has changed a lot, certainly, in the 20th century with the Tofra and the structuring of the state to counteract that tendency. But tribal discourses, I think, have a potential to sort of shape autonomous ideas about social identity and community that religious discourses rarely do. Remember, I mean, if we're drifting a little, Khomeini's interpretation of the proof texts, the scriptural proof text, was perceived as an outlier's interpretation, was perceived as a minority view. In general, ulama ad-din have thought that it's best to support the ruler, to provide nasiha to the rulers, but not to claim dominion unto themselves as the rightful political authorities. The tribe doesn't have that kind of concern. So I'm digressing a little here, but I do feel that there's a tension between these discourses. One, for reasons I've described, the sort of innate autonomy of tribal discourse, but as importantly, the tension has to do with the purpose of religious discourses and ideas and identities on the one hand, and the purpose of tribal identities. Religion, Islam in particular, and other faiths, I would say Christianity and Islam in particular, are universalizing faiths. They aspire to the universalizing of their precepts. They don't limit in principle, they're not seeking to limit the application of their morals and their ethics, right? So religious discourse is believed to extend, to encompass tribal persons, settled Bedouin, certainly as the Mutawa'in were tasked to teach and preach in the early 20th century to the Bedouin, especially to the Ikhwan Bedouin who were rebelling. But tribal discourse does not have universalized tribal identity, tribal ideas, tribal groups don't have the same universalizing tendencies. In fact, they tend toward the opposite direction, toward fractiousness, towards sub-state, subgroup, towards smaller group identity. At least when we talk about national community, they are smaller. The tribes are the components of a national community or splinter groups from potentially. So I think that tension is interesting to think about. It's all rather abstract what I'm saying, but I think it's useful for us to frame the issues before we try to interpret and find empirical support or refutation of them. I shouldn't say more because it's a study that really awaits real hefty review. But except for the fact that if we come back to the topic of this lecture, Khaled Jasser's work and my book on Sab, on Ilm al-Ansab and his work there, we see, I think, an interesting manifestation of this tension in play. So in particular with Khaled Jasser's Bahila in 1990, the book that he publishes, we see, I think, a kind of crowning expression of his of his intellectual work and the framework that he built up over the decades. In his direct critique of Ali Tantawi, an important alim, one of the early satellite scholars in the kingdom, the critique that he advances is as much a kind of nationalist one as a scholarly one. But what he does, and it's fascinating, he couches this critique in the linguistic register of religion. He uses the language of religion. He accuses, for example, Tantawi of taqlid. He accuses him of what the Salafis, like Tantawi, accuse others of practicing. Taqlid in disparaging the reputation of the Bahila tribe, simply because other legal works that preceded him in other centuries use such disparaging examples as anecdotes. And so here, Khaled Jasser, in sort of shifting to another frame, how religion and tribe interact, Khaled Jasser is using tribal genealogies, these very particular facts, arcane, quite obscure, right, facts, as his most important evidence, specifically marital patterns, as he argues, the patterns of marriage between Bawahil of the 20th century and other tribes in Najd and elsewhere. Those patterns, for him, prove the falseness of Tantawi's religiously driven critique of the tribe's reputation and history. So we have glimpses and hints at how these discourses and identities interact. But I think it awaits a real scholarly treatment.
So moving to the modern state of Saudi Arabia, the final chapter in your book, you focused on the modern state now, so Saudi today, and I quote you here. You said the following: "Tribal belonging is a central facet of the modern Saudi." I really want to know your thinking behind this statement. Why do tribal genealogies still matter in the modern Saudi Arabia?
When I tried to pose and answer this question, I had in the back of my mind the following premise, which is no complex social historical phenomenon is monocausal. That is, it cannot be reduced to a single cause, a single explanation. If we accept that concern about lineage and genealogy and nasab and tribal identity is a significant thing in the kingdom, and if we accept that it takes many different manifestations, it's not just significant for one reason, then I think we need to consider the many different ways why tribal genealogies matter, and why tribal belonging is, as you say, a central facet of modern Saudi identity. So the sort of answer that I sought to privilege in my book, that I devoted really 4 or 5 of the 6 chapters to, is really sort of the socio-historical answer. And it boils down for me to this idea of a profound dislocation that was experienced by the peoples of Saudi Arabia over the course of the 20th century, and in particular after the post-World War II era, or narrowing down from 1970 forward. The oil age, of course. What is this dislocation? By comparison to Europe, the United States, the Industrial Revolution and the transformation of European and American economies and societies, that process transpired over many hundreds of years. I'm not a historian of Europe, but I'll venture a guess and say 300 years, 250 years. A lot of generational turnover, a lot of cultural turnover, a lot of heritage, lore, folklore, knowledge being passed, incremental progress, incremental regression being made in that period of time. Transformation over a long durée. Saudi Arabia, in material terms, experiences the transformations that were a quarter of a millennium long elsewhere in the course of a generation or two, in the course of 30, 40 years maybe. The material transformation of the kingdom, the urbanization, rural-urban migration, the erection of modern infrastructure, modern systems of communication. All of this is happening at lightning speed in historical terms. As I would tell my students, and as I will share here, that cannot but have a profound influence on people's worldviews, anxieties, sensibilities, aspirations, understandings of themselves and their family and their relations. To take a simple example, from the ancestral dira, where a person or village or town where a Saudi person may have been living up to the middle of the 20th century, or in the first half at least, amongst oftentimes their extended kin, as well as maybe several other community groups, families. Work opportunities, the necessities of life compel them to migrate to big cities where they settle down in a somewhat arbitrary fashion, maybe, where their neighbors, that is to say, locale, in terms of locale, where their neighbors are not necessarily their cousins or their family members. They might not be from their region where they come from. They might not be from, they might not have anything in common except language, perhaps, and maybe some new sense of a national communal identity. That's just an example of the transformation, let alone all the other things that I alluded to. But in particular, the dislocation of people from their traditional places of habitation with their kin groups, I think had a profound effect and caused people to want to rummage through history to figure out deeper connections to their societies, to their broader national community, as a way of counteracting that feeling of dislocation. Remember, this dislocation is transpiring against the backdrop of what I refer to as the inqita, the rupture that separates Central Arabian history, the modern history of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, one of the most wealthy and influential nations in the world, from Arab Islamic history of the first 3 centuries. Why? Because Al-Jazira al-Arabiya, after the move of the Caliphate to Damascus, becomes less significant to history. Less of the main action of Islamic history is transpiring in Al-Jazira al-Arabiya until the 18th century. And so much as the Wahhabi Da'wah is a world influencing movement, and I think some would argue it is, but especially in the 20th century, really, when the kingdom is established and oil is discovered and exploited, and it becomes a significant node within the broader Middle East and broader Islamic world. So there's the inqita, there's the dislocation of the 20th century. To me, the rush to connect again, symbolically, textually, is a reaction to those phenomena, okay? And Khaled Jasser is in a place where he can put boundaries, he can shape, he can render intelligible and render coherent this process of figuring out who is who and how they relate. Of course, it's a contentious and messy process. You know, any nationalism, any proto-nationalism excludes as much as it includes, you see? So, but it is a process of forming connections at the small scale and then at the larger scale. So that's the social story, or one key aspect of the social story that I think drives the need to affirm tribal identity and tribal heritage. There is another dimension to the story, at least one more, and that is a political dimension to the story, as I understand it. The political dimension takes different facets. In my book, I focused primarily on what I took to be the institutions and techniques that the Saudi state had built up over the course of the 20th century to govern its populations. In a way, the choices that the state made to formalize an organizational system according to tribal association was kind of a path of least resistance. When you look at the revolutionary Republican states of the region, those nations, they came from a different historical experience, colonialism in particular. They did not need to force themselves into their revolutionary posture. It seemed to be, in the 1950s and 1960s, a popular reaction to colonialism. Saudi Arabia did not have the same experience of colonialism, and its history therefore proceeded along a different course. So the ecology of the kingdom rendered it such that there were less major population centers emerging into the 20th century than in other Arab nations. It rendered it such that the dark matter of Bedouin influence and presence was disproportionately significant, more significant in Saudi Arabia than in practically any other Arab state, except perhaps Libya or something. And so the state, which was until the 1970s practically relatively impoverished, started out on the path of least resistance, trying to work with the social structures that existed to police and order the political space as well as it could. But as with the emergence of modern institutions, this is to me a fascinating, I think, part of the story. With the emergence of modern institutions, there was no divergence from that course on the part of the Saudi state. The Saudi state continued to view its populations in the same way as it had, largely speaking, I think in the 20s and the 30s. But the techniques that it used to govern this large, increasingly urbanized populace change. And so the political instruments, the political ideologies, and the political institutions that are brought to bear on this question of citizen identity, citizen political identity, are quite novel, it seems to me, quite distinct for a society like Saudi Arabia. And they seem to persist in many ways. In my reading, therefore, all of this is to say that because the state decided that it wanted to govern its citizens within a relatively traditional definition and understanding of citizen identity, this elevated, enhanced the interest of the common person, of the average person in Saudi Arabia, in their tribal identity, in their tribal heritage, because it became such a significant factor for public life, for the receipt of certain benefits from the state, for the sort of identification of one's status at a range of different levels. So there's the social story and the political story. We don't want to think overly deterministic about the politics of it, but the politics matters. How states choose to govern, just as the individual will of Khaled Jasser was relevant in, I think, the key factor in explaining how he came to forge his own path and become Alamat al-Jazeera. The state's choices matter for why genealogy becomes significant. And of course, ultimately, it becomes a bit of a hot potato, as they say idiomatically here. If you want to govern via NSAB, you're going to have trouble when you have different interpretations over lineages and tribal affiliations and so forth. You're going to have some difficulty there, as it seems to be the case. And that's why a book like the Jamhara can't be written again. It's for among other questions that are pertinent.
So thank you. Just following your question, your covering of the modern state identity, I just got a very interesting question from one of the audience, if you allow me to answer, to give you this. Yeah. So it's from Dr. Huda Al-Hlasi. She's asking what other projections you can make for the future Saudi identity regarding the tribal identity. Will this die out, or will the sense of belonging increase? And she's also asking about the younger generation and how they feel about the whole tribal belonging thing.
Yeah. Of course, it's hard to predict the future, but I think there are countervailing tendencies in play. So on the one hand, we have a national project, it seems to me, that is emerging now, that is de-emphasizing, to a certain degree, religious discourses, religious authority, and at the very least, the predominance of religion as the kind of basis of Saudi citizen identity, right? So the question becomes, what fills that vacuum? What fills that space that had been cultivated and invested in so intensively for so many decades, assuming that space is, opening up. Here we can talk about maybe two other buckets, right? There is this whole sort of tribal heritage question, and then there is the sort of globalized social media cultural, want to say secularizing pop identity. And that has been, since the internet emerged in Saudi Arabia, in 1999, there has been an attraction to that cultural, the sort of global internet-driven secularizing culture. And not just in Saudi Arabia, but throughout the world, people are converging on that. And that, I think, has a tendency to temper the harder edges of, I'm not speaking about religious discourse necessarily, but of the sort of maybe the tribal discourse. It will have, I think, a tendency to temper the harder edges in the sense of connecting people to bigger identities that are not rooted in religion, bigger global communal identities that are not really rooted in religion, creating a third alternative, perhaps, right? But tribal identity is a bedrock for many people at many levels. The extent to which we see a decrease in people's interest in sort of their tribal identity, their tribal heritage, I think depends on a lot of factors that are hard to predict. But the way to measure it, I think, one way to measure it would be to look at if there's any divergence between an increasing discourse of tribalism on the one hand, where if you know, social media and bulletin boards and other, you know, spaces see a proliferation of tribal pride, but if patterns of tribal endogamy are decreasing, if scholars identify empirically patterns of marital practice across ranges of tribes and regions in the kingdom, you'll then have kind of a way to map out actually a scientific answer to that question. I mean, without being too deterministic about the relationship between tribal endogamy and tribalism, but still, it is a key. It's as good an indicator as you're going to get for the prevalence of these sentiments, because that's where it counts. That's where it matters. Family marital alliances and relationships, the proliferation of love marriage to the extent that it is increasing beyond more than anecdotally, let's say, that'll be a measure. This will be a measure for us and for others who are interested. So you have, I think, a nationalist discourse. You know, there's some complexity here, but I think you have a nationalist discourse that can take out of the sense of tribal heritage something more generic, something less, just as the global culture is defanging some of the hard edges of the tribal discourse. I think nationalism, one like a sort of the pride in Saudi Arab identity, it borrows from the tribal discourses. There's no doubt it borrows. You know, Janadiriya and these festivals borrow from the particularistic tribal discourses and try to make of them something a little bit more universal within the national community. So that unto itself will produce a kind of probably waning of particularist tribal identity. At the same time, these techniques of governance that I describe, institutions, techniques, and practices that I talk about in my book in chapter 6, I don't know that they have dissipated any since I've written the book. My sense is that in some ways, with respect to the position of the mu'arrif, al-mu'arrifun, and Sheikh al-Qabila, wal-na'ib al-Sheikh al-Qabila, these positions are now actually more formalized, more so than even when I wrote my book. And so I think societies are complex. You have countervailing tendencies. You have a globalizing culture and a new nationalist discourse that might be diminishing the tougher edges of tribal asabiya al-Qabaliya, right? But you have those institutions, practices, and ideologies of state, of governance that are persisting and in some ways perhaps even becoming enhanced. That would be my, and as far as the youth are concerned, I think they're encompassed within that analysis. Yeah.
Just to end our discussion, if you can mention the woman role in the genealogies culture, and you mentioned that in your book, in the fourth chapter, you actually mentioned it to me that was like the most interesting interview you ever have done. I don't know if you will be to share this with our audience.
By all means, no. I mean, I remarked that one of the most memorable interviews that I did was with Khaled Jasser's Sheikh Khaled Jasser's daughter, Dr. May Jasser, for the rare perspective that she provided on both her father's life, on the history of her society, and lastly, and most significantly, the sort of a woman's negotiation of that narrative that I had heard 100 times over from male disciples and friends and family of the Sheikh. It's a complex, we didn't discuss Ansab so much, Dr. May and I, as rather fill out the contours of her father's life in ways that only she could fill out for me. But with respect to nasab in women, this is a very interesting and complicated topic. And what it does is underscore for us that the culture of celebrating lineages that exists today is very much, it has a very strong ideological dimension, in so much as it focuses on the patrilineal, on the father-son line through history, and in so doing obscures the existence of the matrilineal, the females in the line from mythic time to the present. And with the reforms that are currently advancing in Saudi society, I wonder if there are women who have decided that they would be interested in taking, making of this aspect of heritage women's work, something of their own. I heard inklings of this from friends in the kingdom, that there were families that were making shajarat nasab lil nisa or shajarat nasab lil rijal, which was interesting. And what is fascinating to me when I think of this question is also, it wasn't necessarily the way that genealogies were documented before the modern culture of nasab and sab was emerged. We don't have a big sample set. We don't have many examples, but there is at least one genealogical work at the Dara that dates to the early 20th century that does list the names of women and matriarchs, which suggests that, as often is the case, we think of history as unidirectional, advancing in sort of a predictable way, but the absence of women's names from genealogical records in the 70s, 80s, and 90s could well just be an interlude in history, awaiting a restoration where there was a recognition of the role that the entire kinship group played in the perpetuation of families and extended families and the heritage and the tribal or community heritage therein. So there's more in chapter 4 if anybody wants to read about that topic. I set out to write a chapter about the woman's perspective on nasab, believe it or not, and I failed in that effort. So I thought the way to get to it was through a kind of as careful as possible study of marriage and marital patterns. And this is where I found Bahla to be, the book by Sheikh Khaled Jasser, to be immensely rewarding in tying together all these loose threads that I've presented to you today.
Just following the question of the marriage at nasab, I have a really interesting question here, and it's about what would you say Jasser work and the culture of the modern genealogy in Saudi Arabia sees him as a continuation of some old tradition of matching nasab for marriage?
Do I see him as in continuation with an older tradition?
Yes.
I certainly would see that. I mean, this was not a phenomenon that I read about, learned about at the time of my research. That there were such men in society who reserved that role. I would imagine that the learned person in a village or town, among their many roles, this could have been one of theirs, and among one of the uses of ansab, besides like fara'id and other related subjects, could have been that. But in light of the question, I would say certainly Khaled Jasser existed in continuity with so many traditions of his Islamic cultural world, his Najdi world, that it doesn't surprise me to think of him in that light. Of course, now He's performing this work, this role for a much wider community of people. People from all around the kingdom are writing him. They're knocking on his door. They are asking him for his help. They are faxing him. They are calling him on the phone. And in fact, at the beginning of chapter 4, I relate a story from Dr. May, where she discusses how she would pick up the phone when people would call the house and say, عندنا سؤال علامة الجزرية لو سمحتم فلان ابن فلان ايش قبيلة من أي قبيلة هذا and Dr. May would ask her father فلان ابن فلان من أي قبيلة هذا and he would, if he knew, he would say, I know, and would relate it. And if he didn't think that they necessarily were from a tribe, he would say, let's do adri. And May would politely hang up with them or tell them this. And she explained, Dr. May explained, and you could hear the relief in their voices or the disappointment when they were given the news. This is a new phenomenon. I know, with respect to the question is phenomenal. It sets us in sort of assuming that there's, that this was a practice, and it makes sense to me. It sets us in that continuity that I believe Khaled Jasser represents, right? But the way it's playing out in the 1980s and 90s and 70s, I guess, as well, is kind of a new thing, and I think it's quite fascinating. It speaks to this sort of thickening and broadening of the definition of society.
Yeah, I've been getting a lot of questions, and some of them about the tribal and non-tribal, and how Sheikh Khaled Jasser documented that in his book, and how he reacted to this at that time.
So that's a tough issue because al-ansab mawdu' al-shaykh, I did my best to tell the story of the social relationships and the kind of key themes and dynamics that emerge from al-murasalat and from the story of Sheikh Khaled Jasser, without calling attention to the specific individuals who are petitioning him and so forth, precisely because I heard from everyone that, this could be embarrassing to people. This could be discomforting if their private, if their private lives are revealed in this way, and underlying that is that tension between that lay behind Khaled Jasser's project. On the one hand, he wanted to assert the tribal belonging and the authentic belonging of the vast majority of the peoples of Najd to Najd historically, to Arabia historically, believing that many of those who had lost their quote unquote nasab, in fact, were asil. Were asil. This is his pronouncement. This is the motivator for his project as he describes it. But of course, every project of social taxonomy, classification, even if it's one that's generous in spirit, right, trying to expand the tent, it's going to leave some people on the outside, especially if you establish the criteria. We're going to look at your family's original domicile, the al-bulda al-asliya. We're going to look at the marital patterns of your family. We're going to look at the name, right? And then I will, Khaled Jasser would say, I can then make a determination, possibly, as to what your origin is. For those people who couldn't produce that information, maybe they were orphans of a tribal family. Who knows, right? Maybe they just couldn't articulate themselves well in writing. They were too young, or their just level was not sufficient to pass muster with the grammarian, Sheikh Khaled Jasser. So his lack of a response or willingness to cooperate, could have implications for that person's aspirations to belong to this big tent. So, it's a significant problem. And, there were people, I kind of 5, 6, 7, 8 years removed from my project. You remember the good things about your project and your experiences, but not everybody loved Sheikh Khaled Jasser, and it's precisely for the reason that this questioner alludes to. Stepping into this issue and trying to create boundary lines, even if with generous intentions, Hassananiya, created some sore, some sore feelings for people, and maybe left some people out of the framework who wanted to be inside of it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nadav, for a very rich, interesting discussion. There is so many questions. I promise all of them who sent them, I'll send it to Dr. Nadav, and hopefully you can answer them later. But thank you very much. Thank you for everyone who joined us today. Thank you for your time. The last words for you, Dr. Nadav, if you want to end it.
فقط أشكركم لضيافتكم المستمرة, and thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. This is going to be the end of the webinar. Thank you all.